Now that I spent 1 year in Mexico, it is time for me to share my experience with you. If you've watched my videos in the past, then you know that I wanted to wait with this video until I reached the 1 year mark, and it happened. So let me tell you about my experience living in Mexico, what I liked, what I didn't like, why I chose Mexico, and much more. Let's start with why I chose Mexico. Well, basically in 2021, we were in the middle of the pandemic, and it was time to choose a place to nomad in. I wanted to spend time outside the United States where I lived, and I felt like Mexico was a great choice, and let me tell you why. Asia was very closed during COVID. From early 2020 until mid to late 2022, Asia was pretty closed. But now that Asia is open again, people are going there, but back then it was very difficult to impossible to go to certain countries. Mexico was one of the few countries that didn't require you to be vaccinated, didn't require you to get a test done prior to departure, nothing. You could go to Mexico pretty much as always. And so that's what I was looking for, and that's what other people were looking for, and I think that was one of the main reasons why I decided to choose Mexico and not some different country that had much weirder entry requirements, funnier entry requirements, right? So that was the reason. I wanted to have less problems, and I just wanted to have a good time without all the COVID nonsense. And that's why I chose Mexico in 2021 and not Asia, not Africa. I just wanted to have it easy. And Mexico made it easy. I think Mexico was very generous. All the people who were able to enter the country during the corona pandemic, not asking them for a whole lot of stuff to enter the country. And I've said this before, Mexico really used the COVID pandemic to build its reputation. And so many people got to try Mexico and they liked it. They liked the taste that they had in their mouth, or still have in their mouths, right? And so that's just important, right? To find a country that's open during times of great uncertainty. I wanted to add something here because people have been talking about this in the comment sections of one of my videos, and what I'm talking about here is the mask requirement that was in place, in certain states in Mexico. And that held especially true for certain states in central Mexico, because people visited Guadalajara or Puebla and they were surprised that they weren't able to go into any shop without a mask on their mouth. And so that was true in certain states. Like I said, Guadalajara or Puebla was true in those states. But if you, spend time in the Caribbean, or if you were in like Veracruz, it was just more relaxed in some other states. And so, it's the same as in the US too. It was more relaxed in Texas than it was in California, right? So states are different. Even though it's the same country, states have different rules or had different rules and different regulations during COVID. So I wanted to make this clear because I don't want you guys to be confused, if you hear something like that and, it's just not true, or it's partially true. So that was the reason, right? So Mexico was very generous to me, and I appreciate that. And if you spend time in Mexico during COVID, you know that Mexico was also very generous to you. Very important stuff. Now let's talk about the visa situation. A very important point. And basically you can visit Mexico for 180 days, within a 365-day time window without a visa. It's a visa on arrival for Western tourists. If you're from the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, you can go to Mexico and do that without a visa. And normally, under most circumstances, you should get 180 days, unless you have abused this system already in the past, and it's different, If they can review your passport, if you have many stamps and yada, 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 then it's a different story. But I was always fortunate to have received 180 days in my passport, so I'm very grateful for that as well. If you want to go to Mexico, if you want to live in Mexico and, you're like, hey, I want to make this maybe my new home or my second home, you can get temporary residency. You can apply outside the country. Just go to your consulate, get the paperwork done. You need to prove economic solvency. So you got to have some savings, right? Got to have some liquid assets, cash. And if you have that, you can apply, like I said, at the consulate in your home country. And you can also get permanent residency, but it's a little bit more difficult. You need more savings, and the waiting times are typically longer. You can also apply for temporary residency within Mexico or inside Mexico, okay? That's all doable. So Mexico has really good residence permits, and they're not so difficult to obtain. It's much more difficult to get a residence permit in certain European countries or in the United States. We know it's very difficult to get residency in the US. Another thing that I like about Mexico is that you can own property, you can own real estate as a foreigner, which is not the case in many Asian countries. And that may not be important to you, may be important to you, really depends on your life goals, depends on where you're at in life. But that's something that's important, because if you want to settle down in a country, you want to eventually own some property, right? Especially if you have some money to play with. And that's definitely the case in Mexico. You can own real estate. You can even, buy an apartment without a residence permit. So foreigners are allowed to own real estate in Mexico. All right, let's talk about the not so good experiences, okay? Because there were some. And I would say that, the places where I stayed in Cancun, I was followed by the police once. It was late at night. Whatever they were trying to do, probably wanted to check me for drugs so they can keep my cash, which is something that happens very often there. And so I was just fortunate to have escaped into a restaurant, because I saw that they were following me. Why? I crossed the road and then they were making a U-turn, so it was pretty obvious. Like I said, I went into a restaurant and they stopped right in front of the restaurant. Probably thought, should we go in, should we not go in? But then I went in there, stayed some time in there, and they left. They were looking for an easier target, because they don't want to make it too obvious, especially if there are people around. So like I said, this almost happened to me. Well, it kind of happened, but thankfully I was aware of the situation and I prevented the situation from escalating and losing some cash, some paper cash. But so that was a not so positive experience. Then what was another not so good experience? I would say some of the food. It really depends on where you eat. I'd say that the Caribbean side is pretty overpriced. You pay a lot more than you do in Asia. Not saying the food is not bad, but I think, on the Caribbean side, you have less diversity. You have less authentic Mexican food. I mean, you have tacos, I guess, but you have a lot of foreign food options there, which some people like, especially tourists. They want to have everything in one place. I get it. I personally love the traditional Central Mexican cuisine. So what you get in Puebla, what you get in Mexico City, in my opinion, is far better, far more diverse than what you will ever have in the Caribbean. I prefer Central Mexico. I prefer the state of Veracruz over the Caribbean. There's nothing wrong with the Caribbean side of Mexico. The Caribbean side of Mexico is beautiful. The weather's great, nice beaches. And if you go there during the summertime, when it's less touristy, you can probably find cheaper accommodation and there are fewer tourists. So I was on the Caribbean side in the winter time, peak time, prime time. And so I was just confronted with a lot of tourists. And like I said, I just prefer places that are more authentic. And so I wouldn't go there again during winter. I would go there during, summertime, when there are fewer tourists, because in the summertime, people don't really go to Mexico because they can spend time at home. It's nice where they're at, so they don't want to travel. So two things I didn't like too much were, of course, the prices. The prices were kind of steep. And the food on the Caribbean side, not particularly great, not particularly diverse. So I prefer Central Mexico. It's much better, it's cheaper, it's more authentic, food's better, and fewer tourists, right? Of course, Mexico City got a lot of tourists, but there are plenty of places in Central Mexico with fewer tourists than you see in the Caribbean. Okay, so other than that, I had a great time, and as always, I always say that because it's true. I'm grateful for the time I was able to enjoy. It's important to be appreciative in life, and so I definitely go back to Mexico. I love the country. The people were very hospitable. I think it was reasonably priced, not in the Caribbean, but in the other places I stayed. So I recommend Mexico for its hospitality, its liberal visa policies, its great and diverse cuisine, and also its great and diverse sceneries, landscapes, different states. Great place to spend time in. Now my question to you is, what is your favorite state in Mexico and why? Leave a comment below and let us know. Subscribe now and turn on alerts to never miss any of my future nomadism, dating, and business advice videos. Thank you for watching.